The injustice begins. Introduction of the protagonist. In the quiet expanse of a mid-sized city, where cityscapes stretch lazily across the horizon and the hum of traffic fills the background, James Ellis lived a life defined by hard work, integrity, and unwavering belief in justice. At 42, he had carved out a distinguished career as a federal prosecutor. Known for his analytical mind and relentless pursuit of truth, James had earned respect from his peers and admiration from those who understood the work he did. As a black man, he had faced an immense uphill battle throughout his career, but he had refused to let adversity define him. His daily life was a carefully managed balance of meetings, investigations, and courtroom appearances. He was known for his exceptional ability to read a case and dismantle the defense with precision. His colleagues often sought his advice, and many of the cases he took on had made a significant impact on the judicial system. But beyond the courtroom, James was also a quiet man. He preferred solitude after work, often retreating to his apartment, reading case law, or tending to the plants that lined his windowsills. The work he did was personal, an ongoing commitment to a society he knew still had deep flaws, but one he believed could change, if only given the right guidance. Today, like any other, James started his morning with his routine, a cup of coffee, a quick scan of his emails, and a few minutes spent reading the news. The articles were predictable: politicians embroiled in scandal, stories of economic struggle, and a mention of a new trial he was preparing for. He dressed in a sharp navy suit, one of many in his wardrobe, and was out the door before 7:30 a.m. The car ride to work was routine as well, his mind preoccupied with case details, but there was one brief interruption. A siren, followed by a red and blue flash, flickered in his rearview mirror. His brow furrowed, but he didn't panic. He pulled his car over to the side of the road, noting that he was well within the speed limit. Maybe it was a simple mistake, maybe the officer needed something. Nothing more than an inconvenience, he thought. But this would be no simple mistake. Setting the stage for the conflict. The officer, a young man barely out of his 20s, approached James's car with a hint of hesitation. His hand rested on his holstered gun as if preparing for something. James noted the officer's wariness, but he didn't feel any particular threat. He kept his hands on the steering wheel, visible to the officer, and greeted him politely. "Good morning, officer," James said, keeping his tone even and respectful. The officer's response was brisk and unwelcoming. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, his eyes darting between James and the car interior. "No, officer, I wasn't speeding or doing anything illegal," James replied, keeping his voice calm. "Is there a reason?" The officer glanced at his clipboard and then at James, his eyes narrowing slightly. "It's a random stop, sir. Just routine checks." His words were curt, but James recognized a tone that hinted at something more. He was used to such encounters, having experienced racial profiling on more than one occasion in his life. The officer returned to his patrol car, where he lingered longer than necessary, as if waiting for some invisible signal. After a few minutes, he returned, holding a ticket in his hand. "You're getting a fine for expired tags," the officer said, his voice carrying a sharp edge. "You should have checked the registration. Don't want to see you driving without valid tags again." James blinked. His tags were up to date, as he had just renewed them a few weeks ago. This was a mistake, plain and simple, but the officer didn't seem to care. "Officer, my registration was renewed," James said calmly. "I have the receipt right here." He pulled out his phone to show the electronic receipt confirming the renewal, but the officer waved it off dismissively. "No need for your excuses, sir," the officer replied, his tone now noticeably colder. "The fine stands. Pay it and move on." The exchange felt odd, disjointed. The officer hadn't even glanced at the proof, and there was no acknowledgement of James's courteous response. As if the officer had already made up his mind about who James was, or who he thought James was. The interaction ended quickly, with the officer handing James a ticket that was unnecessarily large and heavy for the violation. He didn't even say goodbye, just turned on his heel and walked back to his patrol car. James was left with a ticket in hand, his thoughts swirling. The whole encounter felt off, but he knew that fighting it on the spot would do no good. Instead, he would take the proper steps, he would pay the fine and then challenge the officer's actions through the appropriate channels. However, there was more to this than just an erroneous ticket. He had been unfairly targeted and dismissed. Something in the officer's tone had gnawed at him, something deeper than simple incompetence. This was a man who had judged him, before ever knowing his true identity. The racist encounter. That evening, James could not shake the unsettling feeling that had lingered since the stop. He told no one, not at first. His colleagues would dismiss the incident, the way they always did, suggesting it was just an unfortunate brush with an officer having a bad day. But James knew better. The officer's demeanor, his unspoken judgment, had been a clear indication that he had seen James only for his skin, not for who he really was. The real shock came the next day when James was called into court for another matter. His mind was still on the ticket, and as he entered the courtroom, he saw the judge who had made his earlier stop. This time, it was the courtroom itself where the real injustice would unfold. The judge, a middle-aged man named Judge Harold Stevens, was presiding over a different case, one unrelated to James's ticket. The judge was known in town for his conservative leanings, but what James didn't realize at first was that Stevens had a reputation for being biased, especially toward people of color. It wasn't common knowledge, but it was certainly whispered about behind closed doors. James took his seat, preparing to do his job as a prosecutor. He glanced up at the judge and immediately felt a chill run down his spine. There was no mistake now, Judge Stevens was the same man who had issued his ticket. The same man who had dismissed him with a sneer of indifference. As the case in front of the judge unfolded, James sat in quiet reflection. He realized, with a shock, that the judge had not only failed to recognize him, he had assumed, without question, that James was just another black man unworthy of respect. He had not only imposed a fine that wasn't deserved, but had also mocked James in ways the man hadn't even fully understood at the time. Stevens called out the name of the defendant, and the courtroom continued on. But in the back of his mind, James was already formulating a plan. This man, the judge who held such power, who wielded his position to crush others, would not escape the consequences of his biases. Inner turmoil. James felt the heavy weight of the injustice as it settled deeper into his chest. He had been disrespected, belittled, and judged, quite literally. The emotions inside him swirled into a mixture of frustration and disillusionment. It was one thing to face racism in the streets, but to face it in the very halls of justice? That was a new kind of betrayal. But despite the turmoil within, James held himself steady. He wouldn't retaliate immediately. He wouldn't let his anger cloud his judgment. He was better than that, and he knew it. But he also knew that this encounter, this man, was something that couldn't simply be ignored. The system had to be reminded that it was capable of doing better. And James would be the one to remind it. The road ahead would be difficult. He knew that exposing the judge's bias would not be an easy task. But James Ellis was no stranger to battles that required patience and meticulous planning. This was not a fight for just one person, it was a fight for the integrity of the judicial system itself. The fight for justice, the fight for truth, and the fight to dismantle the layers of prejudice that still clouded the halls of power. As James sat quietly in the courtroom, he vowed to handle the situation with dignity. The time for action would come soon. The consequences of bias. Public humiliation. James sat at his desk in his office, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead the only sound. His computer screen flickered, but his mind was 1,000 miles away. The hours since he had sat in that courtroom had felt like a blur, a weight that refused to lift. The judge, Harold Stevens, was not just a man in a robe, handing down judgments. No, Stevens was the embodiment of a deeply ingrained prejudice, one that was woven into the very fabric of the justice system James had dedicated his life to. He rubbed his temples as he stared at the case file in front of him, but the numbers and legal jargon were meaningless to him in that moment. What stung the most was not just the petty and unfounded treatment he'd received during that stop, but the realization that he was constantly subjected to these indignities simply because of the color of his skin. He had been humiliated publicly by a man who didn't know the first thing about him, who had dismissed him because of the preconceived notions he had about black men in power. James had always known that systemic racism was a pervasive issue. He had seen it, studied it, and, in many cases, fought against it. But this? This felt personal. It was the kind of bias that could destroy careers, families, and reputations without a single word being spoken directly. Stevens had made an assumption, an ugly, harmful one, about James's worth and authority, one that transcended the moment in the courtroom and infected everything that James had worked for. For years, James had maintained a professional distance from the subtle whispers and side glances that often accompanied black professionals in positions of power. He had worked in the legal system, moving up the ranks, letting his work speak for him, never letting his race overshadow his merit. But Stevens had crossed a line. He had assumed, with all his authority and privilege, that James was just another black man who could be dismissed, belittled, and humiliated. What stung the most was that Stevens wasn't alone. James's own thoughts betrayed him now. He could no longer deny that he had encountered instances like this before. He had been passed over for promotions, overlooked in meetings, and dismissed in professional circles by colleagues who couldn't see past his skin color. Those subtle slights, which had been easy to ignore for years, now felt like glaring, unhealed wounds. They were the result of something far deeper than a single encounter. This was a system that had long built itself on the foundations of exclusion and bias. James knew it wasn't just about one judge or one police officer. It was about a larger, systemic issue, the kind of institutionalized racism that existed in the courts, in the legal profession, and in nearly every industry in the country. His feelings of humiliation slowly turned into something else, a quiet but intense fire burning inside him. The anger that simmered beneath the surface wasn't just his own, it was the anger of every person who had been unjustly treated, overlooked, or dismissed. It was the anger of every person who had ever been judged before they even spoke, simply because of how they looked. But James wasn't just another angry black man. He was a prosecutor. And he had a duty to fight for justice. He had a duty to confront the kind of biases that had nearly destroyed his career, and to ensure that such injustices would not stand unchallenged. Fighting for justice. That night, James didn't sleep much. His mind was running through every possible angle, every possible strategy. He knew he had to act. He couldn't let the incident go. He couldn't just let the judge's actions slide, not when the consequences of ignoring it could mean more black professionals like him would continue to face this kind of discrimination. He wasn't the only one who had been affected by Stevens's biases, and he knew this was far from an isolated case. By morning, James had made up his mind. He would not let this go. The fight for justice wasn't always loud, it wasn't always a courtroom battle with headlines or media attention. Sometimes, it was about digging into the quiet corners of the system, where the real injustice festered unnoticed. James would take action, but it would be measured, deliberate. He wasn't going to give Stevens the satisfaction of watching him burn with anger. He would outsmart him, expose him, and make sure the world knew who Stevens really was. He spent the next several days researching. He knew Stevens's reputation, his conservative political leanings, his tendency to make rulings that favored the privileged, his track record of dismissing cases that involved people of color. He started compiling evidence, looking through past rulings, court transcripts, and any public commentary that might shed light on Stevens's biases. It wasn't enough to just be angry. James knew he had to build a case that would not only expose Stevens's prejudice, but also show how deeply entrenched racial discrimination was in the very system meant to uphold justice. James reached out to a few trusted colleagues, fellow legal professionals he knew would understand the seriousness of what he was about to do. He was careful, not wanting to tip his hand too early, but he needed people who could help him gather the information, review the legal framework, and ensure that everything was above board. They were shocked by the idea of taking down a sitting judge, but they also knew how necessary it was. they were willing to help. He spent the next several weeks quietly gathering evidence. It wasn't just about Stevens's interactions with him, it was about his entire career. The way he had handled cases involving black defendants. The way he had ruled in cases where racial discrimination was at the heart of the matter. James began to see a disturbing pattern emerge. Stevens wasn't just an isolated racist individual. He was part of a larger network of individuals who maintained and enforced systemic discrimination through the very laws they were sworn to uphold. James knew he couldn't bring this kind of case without solid evidence. So, he worked meticulously, cross-referencing everything. He pored over case files, court rulings, even personal statements from colleagues and witnesses who had worked with Stevens. The evidence was mounting. It wasn't just a personal grievance, it was something much larger, and he was determined to expose it. But there were risks. Going after a judge wasn't something most people would ever consider, let alone pursue. Stevens had power, real power, and going after him meant James would have to face everything he had worked for being put on the line. He knew the risks of losing his career, of being labeled a troublemaker, a disgruntled employee. He also knew that Stevens wasn't the only judge out there with similar prejudices. But the possibility of failure didn't scare him. What scared him more was allowing injustice to go unchallenged, to let a system that was already flawed grow even more corrupt without taking a stand. A growing case. As the weeks passed, the case against Judge Stevens grew stronger. James's team had compiled a wealth of evidence, testimony from attorneys who had worked with Stevens, accounts of his behavior in court, and a pattern of rulings that disproportionately harmed people of color. The evidence was damning, but James knew that it was more than just a matter of proving the judge's biases, it was about revealing the deeper, insidious nature of the system that allowed such behavior to persist. James's growing sense of purpose was fueled by more than just the need to expose Stevens's flaws. It was a calling, a duty that came with his position. He knew that every action he took, every piece of evidence he gathered, had the potential to change not only the life of one man but to spark a much larger conversation about the biases that had plagued the legal system for generations. But as his case developed, James had to navigate treacherous waters. His colleagues started to notice his quiet determination, and whispers began to spread. Some were supportive, but others were skeptical. They didn't understand why he was risking everything for a case that seemed so personal. What they didn't see was that it wasn't just about Stevens, it was about a system that had long treated black professionals like James as second-class citizens, despite their credentials, despite their worth. He spent the next several weeks quietly gathering evidence. It wasn't just about Stevens's interactions with him, it was about his entire career. The way he had handled cases involving black defendants. The way he had ruled in cases where racial discrimination was at the heart of the matter. James began to see a disturbing pattern emerge. Stevens wasn't just an isolated racist individual. He was part of a larger network of individuals who maintained and enforced systemic discrimination through the very laws they were sworn to uphold. James knew he couldn't bring this kind of case without solid evidence. So, he worked meticulously, cross-referencing everything. He pored over case files, court rulings, even personal statements from colleagues and witnesses who had worked with Stevens. The evidence was mounting. It wasn't just a personal grievance, it was something much larger, and he was determined to expose it. But there were risks. Going after a judge wasn't something most people would ever consider, let alone pursue. Stevens had power, real power, and going after him meant James would have to face everything he had worked for being put on the line. He knew the risks of losing his career, of being labeled a troublemaker, a disgruntled employee. He also knew that Stevens wasn't the only judge out there with similar prejudices. But the possibility of failure didn't scare him. What scared him more was allowing injustice to go unchallenged, to let a system that was already flawed grow even more corrupt without taking a stand. A growing case. As the weeks passed, the case against Judge Stevens grew stronger. James's team had compiled a wealth of evidence, testimony from attorneys who had worked with Stevens, accounts of his behavior in court, and a pattern of rulings that disproportionately harmed people of color. The evidence was damning, But James knew that it was more than just a matter of proving the judge's biases. It was about revealing the deeper, insidious nature of the system that allowed such behavior to persist. James's growing sense of purpose was fueled by more than just the need to expose Stevens's flaws. It was a calling, a duty that came with his position. He knew that every action he took, every piece of evidence he gathered, had the potential to change not only the life of one man but to spark a much larger conversation about the biases that had plagued the legal system for generations. But as his case developed, James had to navigate treacherous waters. His colleagues started to notice his quiet determination, and whispers began to spread. Some were supportive, but others were skeptical. They didn't understand why he was risking everything for a case that seemed so personal. What they didn't see was that it wasn't just about Stevens, it was about a system that had long treated black professionals like James as second-class citizens, despite their credentials, despite their worth. The more evidence James gathered, the more he realized just how pervasive the problem was. It wasn't just Stevens. It was every judge, every lawyer, every system that allowed bias and racism to fester unchecked. It wasn't a problem that could be solved in a single case, it was a fight that would take years, perhaps decades. But James was willing to fight. For every person who had ever been wronged. For every black man and woman who had been judged unfairly. For the integrity of the legal system itself. And now, as the case against Stevens grew stronger, James had a new resolve. He wasn't just preparing to expose a man, he was preparing to dismantle a system. And he would stop at nothing to see it through: the judge's dismissal. The judge's ignorance. Judge Harold Stevens was a man accustomed to power. His courtroom was his kingdom, and for years, he had ruled with an iron fist, maintaining an air of invincibility. He was used to making quick judgments and dismissing anyone who dared question his authority, especially if that person happened to be a person of color. In Stevens's mind, his position as a judge placed him far above the law he was meant to uphold. His demeanor was one of arrogance, and he often took advantage of his position to wield unnecessary power over the people who appeared before him. The very idea that anyone could challenge him in a meaningful way was laughable to him. When Stevens had dismissed James Ellis at their first encounter, he had done so without giving it a second thought. The fact that James had been a black man who had dared to question his authority only confirmed Stevens's deeply ingrained prejudices. He had assumed that James, like so many others before him, was just another person trying to gain something they didn't deserve. After all, what was a black man doing in a courtroom like this? And when the officer had pulled him over, Stevens had assumed it was a routine violation, one he could handle with the same dismissive attitude he reserved for the common folk who dared cross his path. What Stevens hadn't known, however, was that the man he had so arrogantly dismissed was far from ordinary. James Ellis wasn't just a random citizen, he was a respected federal prosecutor, a man with decades of experience in the legal system. His credentials were impeccable, and his expertise was beyond reproach. But Stevens had no way of knowing that when he'd met James. He had simply assumed, based on his prejudices, that this man, like many others before him, was beneath him, someone who could be easily disregarded. And so, Stevens went about his daily business, believing his ignorance would remain unchallenged. He continued to preside over his courtroom with the same arrogance, dismissing cases involving people of color, ruling harshly without considering the broader implications of his actions. He wasn't worried about the repercussions of his bias. He couldn't fathom that anyone would dare to confront him, especially not someone like James. But as the weeks passed, the effects of his dismissive attitude began to catch up with him. Unknown to Stevens, the very man he had humiliated was carefully laying the groundwork for a reckoning that would shake his entire career. James Ellis was not the kind of man to let an injustice slide, especially not one so deeply rooted in the kind of systemic racism that had plagued the legal profession for generations. The investigation unfolds. James was methodical, patient, and determined. He knew that taking down a judge like Harold Stevens would require more than just a few pieces of evidence. It would require an airtight case, one that would expose the depths of Stevens's racial biases and prove that his actions were not just isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of discrimination and injustice. James had always been a meticulous investigator, and now, he threw himself into the task with even greater intensity. He started by reviewing Stevens's past rulings, combing through case files that involved Black defendants, minority communities, and civil rights issues. What he found was a troubling pattern. Judge Stevens had consistently ruled in favor of the privileged, often making decisions that disproportionately impacted people of color. He was known for dismissing cases where Black defendants had been wronged by the system, making it nearly impossible for them to receive fair trials. And when it came to cases involving racial discrimination, Stevens often turned a blind eye, ruling in favor of law enforcement or wealthy defendants who happened to share his conservative values. But it wasn't just the rulings that concerned James, it was the way Stevens conducted himself in the courtroom. He had a history of making derogatory remarks about Black defendants and attorneys, belittling their arguments and dismissing their evidence without cause. James's investigation revealed testimonies from other lawyers who had worked with Stevens over the years, some of whom had witnessed his blatant racism firsthand. There were accounts of Stevens mocking Black attorneys in private, belittling their achievements, and reducing them to stereotypes. His behavior was nothing short of prejudiced, and it had been going on for years. James also dug into Stevens's personal history. The judge had been a longtime member of a conservative legal organization, one with ties to racial exclusionist groups. While Stevens had never publicly made overtly racist statements, his affiliations, his choice of social circles, and his general disdain for civil rights movements all pointed to a man who had no intention of treating Black individuals equally under the law. As James pieced together the case, he began to see the full scope of the problem. It wasn't just Stevens's individual actions that had to be exposed, it was the way the system had enabled him to perpetuate these biases without consequence. Stevens had operated with impunity, his position shielding him from any real scrutiny or accountability. The legal profession had turned a blind eye to his behavior, either because they shared his views or because they were too afraid to challenge someone in such a powerful position. With each new piece of evidence, James felt his resolve harden. This wasn't just about him or about Stevens, it was about the hundreds of people who had suffered at the hands of a biased system. It was about the future of justice in America. If Stevens was allowed to continue unchecked, it would send a message that the legal system was still fundamentally broken, that racial bias could still be woven into every level of the process. But James knew that exposing Stevens wouldn't be easy. He would need a strategy, a way to present the evidence in a manner that would make the court see Stevens for what he truly was. He would need allies, support from others in the legal community, and the courage to stand against a system that was built to protect judges like Stevens. The courtroom clash. Finally, the day came when James felt ready to take action. He had everything he needed, an airtight case, witness testimony, records of past rulings, and a strategy to confront Stevens directly. The pieces were in place, and he was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. It started in the courtroom, where James prepared to argue a separate case, one that had nothing to do with Stevens directly but would provide the opportunity he needed to challenge him. James was calm as he entered the room, his demeanor cool, collected, and professional. He could feel the weight of the moment, the stakes were high. The eyes of the courtroom were on him, and he knew that everything he did would be scrutinized. Judge Stevens presided over the case, as usual, his demeanor pompous and dismissive. He hadn't yet recognized James, still unaware that the man he had wronged had returned to confront him. James stood tall as he presented his case, his arguments sharp and precise. He had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and every word he spoke was calculated, designed not only to win the case at hand but to slowly unravel Stevens's credibility. At the appropriate moment, James shifted his approach. He introduced a motion to have the case reviewed by a higher court, citing the judge's biased rulings in similar cases. He referenced past cases where Stevens had exhibited clear racial discrimination, making it impossible for any defendant to receive a fair trial under his watch. The room fell silent as James began to make his case, presenting hard evidence of Stevens's prejudiced behavior. He cited testimonies, court transcripts, and examples of Stevens's discriminatory actions in previous rulings. He was no longer just presenting a case, he was presenting the truth. Stevens, who had initially been confident and dismissive, began to fidget. He didn't recognize the significance of James's words, still too arrogant to understand that the man before him had more than just a case against him, he had the truth. The judge, red-faced with irritation, tried to dismiss James's claims, brushing them off with the arrogance that had come to define his career. "This is an attempt to disrupt the court," Stevens snapped. "I will not tolerate this baseless attack." But James didn't back down. He continued, unwavering, presenting every piece of evidence with meticulous care. Each statement, each document, cut deeper into Stevens's defense. The room could feel the tension build, as Stevens's smug expression began to falter, replaced by something more akin to frustration. "Your Honor," James said, his voice calm but laced with authority. "It is you who have disrupted the court, not with the truth, but with your prejudice. You have allowed your biases to shape your rulings, your behavior, and your decisions. You have used your power to silence those who seek justice. And today, that ends." The courtroom held its breath. Stevens, now clearly rattled, struggled to maintain control. His dismissive attitude was no longer working. James had done more than just challenge a judge, he had exposed the cracks in the foundation of a system that had allowed men like Stevens to hold power for far too long. The clash was far from over, but for the first time, Stevens realized that the man he had so arrogantly dismissed was far from ordinary. He was someone who had the power and the determination to bring him down. James wasn't just fighting for justice, he was fighting for a future where bias and prejudice had no place in the courtrooms of America. As the courtroom settled into an uneasy silence, the battle had only just begun.